right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Lamont Virtual Open House or Lamont Open House at Home. I apologize if those of you who have just joined me for a previous session are going to hear a bit of the same introduction from the previous session. So my name is Cassie, and I direct Lamont's Office of Education and Outreach. And we're super excited to be offering you a great lineup this week of virtual open house events. If you're not familiar with Lamont yet, you will definitely be by the end of this week. And if you haven't gone to our website to learn more about the great lineup that we have, for K-12 programming as well as beyond. The website is openhouse.ldeo.columbia.edu, and I'll share that in the chat box here. So Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory is a world-class science research institution. We're actually a part of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, which is made up of about 24 or so research centers, all working to foster a greater understanding of the science behind sustainability and the climate crisis and what we as global citizens can actually do. We're located in Palisades, New York, and we were established in 1949. And open house is a tradition that goes way back to our first director, Maurice Doc Ewing, a pioneering earth scientist who decided that he wanted to open up the campus one day a year to neighbors, to students, to the Columbia University community and beyond. And we've been doing open house ever since, and it's an exciting, remained one of our most important events, an exciting opportunity for both adults and kids of all ages to learn about our planet in a fun and engaging way. So this particular session is going to take us on a virtual field trip to Antarctica. It's the Pack Your Parka session. And we have Frank here. So I see that there's a question about who is Frank, and I'm going to let Frank answer that question when he starts his presentation. So Frank, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Casey, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm the question is like who I am. So I'm happy to take you on a field trip to Antarctica. So I'm going to start with a little bit about myself. I'm a research scientist here at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and my background is geophysics. I mostly do marine geology, geophysics, bit of a specialty of seafloor mapping, studying basically the bottom of the ocean. And I do this, for example, around Antarctica, but also in the Hudson River and other places. But today I'm going to talk about my experience on Antarctica and try to give you an idea like how it is, how we do research in Antarctica and how it's like from the ship. So it's going to be more the marine perspective rather than on the main continent itself, but I think they're going to be interesting for you as well. And I'll come back to the, why we're mapping this seafloor soon as well. So give you a little bit of background about Antarctica. So this is a map of Antarctica, and basically we divide it in two sections. There's the East Antarctica, that is this large section here, and then we have a smaller West Antarctic part here. And the one thing we worry about Antarctica is, what happens when the ice is melting. And so East Antarctica has been, has the amount of ice basically that's equivalent to a little less than 60 meters, so maybe 150 to 180 feet. It's a lot of sea level if all the ice would melt. West Antarctica has much less ice, basically somewhere between 3 and 6 meters. So that's like 9 to maybe 15 feet. Besides that, we're actually more worried about West Antarctica at the moment than about East Antarctica. And one of the reasons is if you take the ice away, so this is now, if you take the ice cap away and we're looking at the bedrock underneath the ice, we can see that everything that's in green, yellow, orange is actually land above sea level, and everything here in blue is basically below sea level. And you see that most of East Antarctica is actually, the bottom below the ice is above sea level, where in West Antarctica, we have like deep blue colors here that's like more than a mile deep. Most of this West Antarctic ice sheet is basically below sea level. That basically means the ice is sitting like in the water, and the water can get to the ice, which makes it very vulnerable to melting. And there's an animation from space that NASA has done. They're mapping basically every year, like how, what is the thickness, what is the elevation of the ice. And then this is like an image basically every month. And you can see here where it's orange and red colors over the years. This is like a record for the last 20 years. It's the ice is melting quite a bit. Where it's in blue, it's actually thickening. So where there's thinning happening, there's a lot of red here, there's a lot of thinning happening. So there's a lot of ice, there's more ice melting than it's forming new. And in the background, what you saw, there was basically the sea ice expanding with the cycles. And I will talk about this in a moment. So as you see in this image, so it's a different map view here. So you see in this area here where we have a lot of red, where there's a lot of thinning happening, this is an area where we're really concerned about, what's happening to Antarctica. And because if the sea level is more ice is melting and sea level is rising, and then a lot of the coastal areas in the world, including New York, but also Miami, might be impacted by that. And so we see a lot of melting here. And then we see also, if we look around Antarctica in color, you see the water temperature. And you see that there's much warmer water in red here in the part of what's called the Amundsen Sea around like West Antarctica, Bellingshausen Sea, where other parts of Antarctica have colder water around it, with a few local exceptions here and there, but it's much more pronounced in this area. So this is why we kind of focus on this area, and especially like one glacier here that's in the center of the West Antarctic ice sheet is called the Thwaites Glacier. And good. And so what's happening actually that's causing the melting that we think? So that's a little illustration. And so I'm basically explaining this also that you kind of see so why we go and study Antarctica. So what's happening there is that this warm water that's sitting in this part of the West Antarctica, it's called the circumpolar deep water, which is like, significantly warmer than what is needed to melt the ice. This water is getting onto what we call the continental shelf, and then it's flowing down towards the ice. And when it comes in contact with the ice, it will melt the ice. And then this melting causes the thinning, because if you melt ice here at the bottom of the glacier, it will also, thin in the top. And the question is now, we know it's melting, we see it in the satellite data, but what's going to happen in the future? How fast it's going to melt? How much is it going to melt? We have to worry about 3 feet of sea level rise in 100 years or 200 years. And there are some models being run, but it's not totally clear what's going to happen because we don't have enough data really. So we have to know basically how easy and how much is the water, of the water is coming towards the ice. How easy is it for the warm water to get there, and how much is melting? And also, if there's any ridges and other bottom obstacles that might keep the glacier in place and slow down the melting. So we go with ships to investigate. And there is the questions like why is the water hot? So there's always like it's not really hot, and I come to that later, but it's warm enough. And we see, this is water around the Antarctic continent. It's just warming up as the oceans are warming with global warming. We get more and more of this warmer water there. And I will later show you some examples of the data and how warm it, what warm really means in this point. So anyway, to study it in detail, so we take ships, and I'm gonna give you an impression like what it is to do the research there. So this is a list of Antarctic expeditions that I've been to, and there was a question like how long I've been working for Lamont. So I've actually been working on Antarctica on and off for much longer than my Lamont. I'm working for Lamont for almost 20 years now, and I have been working in Antarctica for on and off for over 25 years, and been on 8 expeditions so far with different ships. So if you go work in Antarctica, you take icebreakers, and I've been on various icebreakers. On the top is the German Polarstern, the Swedish Odin, and most my trips were with the US icebreaker, the NB Palmer, and it's the main research icebreaker for the Antarctic that the US is running, and it's all the red lines that you see here. If you go on an expedition, the first thing you have to do, you have to have some proper clothing. Luckily, the Antarctic program in the US, at least, will you provide with enough warm clothes. So you get warm shoes, hats, mittens, some warm parkers and things. You actually don't have to bring your own warm parker if you go on a research expedition. You get those from the Antarctic program. But you can always bring some of your own winter stuff as well if you want to. And then if you want to get there, you have 2 options. The first one, you can fly. In Antarctica, there's no other way. You have to, it's surrounded by water, so you can fly. And with the US Antarctic program, you would fly out of New Zealand from Christchurch. And actually, the Air National Guard will provide planes like this. It's basically cargo planes that have cargo in there, and there's some seats in the front, and you have the cargo in the back, and this is how you get there. It's a 10-hour flight from Christchurch. It's pretty long. And once you get there, you get off the plane. There's a special airplanes that can land on the ice, and then they have special buses that get you from the airfield to the main station, McMurdo. So that's a big bus with extra big tires that can drive on the ice. And from there, you would go to McMurdo Base. That's the main Antarctic research station that the US hosts. So it's the largest station in Antarctica. It can, in the summer, can have up to 1,000 people working there. In the winter, they have maybe 50 people on it, but in the peak of the research season in the Antarctic summer, which is December, January, they have up to 1,000 people. And so I said I work on the ship, so I actually would go here and then enter the ship, which you see here, the Nathaniel Palmer. And then we would start our expedition from there. Not always do we go from McMurdo, it's not always convenient. So sometimes we actually take the ship directly from Australia, New Zealand, or from South America. So I was on a expedition just this spring. We left from Punta Arenas in South America, and then we went back. And if you do that, you actually, instead of 10 days, you have to cross the Southern Ocean, which usually takes a week to get to Antarctica. And it can be pretty rough if you take a ship. So this is just an example. And if it works, there's a little video. Southern Ocean is pretty infamous for having really rough seas and weather. So it's not always for the whole week like that, but this is what you can experience if you go through the Southern Ocean. And once you're on the ship, basically, so you stay on a, what's life like? You stay on a cabin. Usually you share with another person. You have bunk beds. They're not really big and comfortable, but good enough. And then, of course, most importantly, there's food on the ship in the galley. So they have usually some kind of buffet style, people sitting on this tables here, and then they have a little snack bar. So Kitchen is open 24 hours, and there's actually 4 meals on the ship. So we have a breakfast, lunch, dinner, and there's a meal at midnight because the ship operates around the clock, so 24 hours. And people who do the work at night, they also get hungry, so they have to eat at midnight as well. So you travel, and while you're going there, you get your equipment ready, and you have some safety training to go through. So you can put on your testing the survival suits, learning how to pack your survival bag, what to bring if you have to work on the ice and things like that. You see everybody has parkas and float coats on when they're working on deck. And then finally, after a week or a little longer, we made it so, and then excitement is getting big on the ship when, the first icebergs and ice are inside after seeing like basically the ocean for a week. And finally we reach the ice. And that might be a good time in my talk to explain about the different types of ice that we have in Antarctica. So I told earlier that we have the big ice sheets, the glaciers. So this is like up to like 1-2 miles, even 3 miles in some sections, thick ice that's sitting directly on the bedrock on the land. And this ice that's built up with snow falling in the center of the ice, and then the weight of the ice is pushing the glaciers towards the ocean. And as it moves forward to the ocean, it gets thinner, and at some point this ice starts to float. It's getting it's not thick enough to be all the way grounded, and the point where it's starting to lift off is called the grounding line. And there's then the floating part is called an ice shelf. It's thinner, but it's still pretty thick. So we're talking 400 or 500 meters, so like over 1,000 feet in places thick. And as the ice moves forward further and further, it actually starts cracking, and then icebergs are breaking off. So the icebergs that are drifting off are still like, there are pieces of the ice shelf, and there still can be like many 100 feet thick. In contrast to the icebergs, we have sea ice. So this is actually ice that's formed when the ocean starts freezing. And this is only a couple of feet thick usually. And so much thinner than the icebergs, but still can be an obstacle for a ship. So that's why we have an icebreaker to get through that. So sea ice is frozen water. So in the winter in Antarctica, that's like our summer, basically June, July. That's a maximum extent. So you see a lot of those sea ice forming around Antarctica here on the left side of the image. And then in the Antarctic summer, that's our winter, like December, January, February, the ice is, sea ice is melting a lot, but it's not going away completely. There's whole patches, for example, here around the Amundsen Sea Thwaites Glacier where we want to go in our expedition. So this still has quite a bit of sea ice usually. So we need the icebreaker to get through that. And we go in January, February, because that's kind of the minimum sea ice conditions. And this is what it would look like if you basically in the ice. And if you do a little time lapse, we're not going that fast usually, but you can see the icebreaker is going through thin ice pretty quickly. And then sometimes when the ice gets a little thicker, it's going here. So these are the examples of ice breaking when, it's like probably like 4 or 5 feet thick. So it takes a little more ship power to go through, and it's pretty noisy if you're in the boat going through that as well. Good. So once we're there, actually in the ice, we actually start meeting the native inhabitants. There's no really people other than researchers. So with the natives are the penguins. It's adelies here. So they live on the sea ice, especially in the summer, where they can rest between the fishing when they go hunting in between. And there's penguins, and the other major group of animals there are seals that are, when we go by on the sea and you see them resting on the ice. Once we're getting to the area now, we're passing through the ice. We start working. So this is a research ship. There's actually a lot of sensors and equipment. So I have a lot of computer screens that needs to be operated, giving us all kinds of scientific data and information that we're collecting constantly with the ship. And so one thing that I'm working on, as I said, is I'm mapping the bottom of the ocean. And we do this for two reasons, because we want to, well, a lot of the bottom of the seafloor is actually not mapped around Antarctica. And we want to know how deep it is. We want to know where the pathway for warm water are. And we can also get detailed information to reconstruct where the ice was in the past before it started melting, and then reconstruct like how fast it might have been, retreating in the past when it was going later. So it's a lot of sitting in front of the computers as a work on the ship in this part. And this is how we map the bottom of the ocean. So we're using sonar. It's basically sound waves that we send from the ship. And then, it's going to be reflected from the bottom of the ocean, and we basically measure the time how long it takes for the sound to come from the ship to the bottom and go back. And we know the speed of sound in the water, so we can calculate the depths. And the modern systems we have, they actually collect the whole swath of data. Good. So this is an example what we actually get after collecting, a lot of bathymetry data and mapping the seafloor with several expeditions. We actually come up with a really good map, and you can see here the blue, different shades of blues are different depths. So the darker blues are steeper. That's actually like 1,500 meters. So that's like basically a mile deep and deeper. The light blue here is, 50, 60 meters or 100 meters. So that's maybe 300 feet. And what we do see is sometimes linear features that tells us that there was ice flowing in this direction. And for what we're interested in now, we see this deep blue, meaning like deeper channels that probably are the pathways for the warm water potentially to go to the trade. So we have like one that might go this way, and we have another one where like the water can be channeled between and around some of those shallower spots and maybe get to the trades this way, or it gets to the Pine Island Glacier over here. So we're looking for this pathway. We try to understand, what is the shallowest part of the water. If it's too shallow, maybe the warm water will be stuck on one side and not all the warm water will get to the glacier. So if we understand that better, how much of, we can calculate how much of the warm water might get to the glacier and how much this is then melting the glacier. So that's one part of the work that's going on. So eventually then we might get actually to the edge of the ice shelf. That's a Pine Island Glacier next to the Trace Glacier. And what you see here, it's this wall of ice basically. So that's like 50 meters, like 100, 150 feet out of the water. And you have basically, another 90% of that, so like 9 times that underwater. So it's only like it's pretty tall, but most of it is actually underwater. It's very thick ice, and it goes on for a long time. Very impressive if you see that. And then you see also icebergs. That's like, the chunks of shelf ice of the ice that actually break up and then drift away. And over time, waves and wind and melting, they from shaping from these tabular ones that we see here in the top right or bottom left, and then create little creative like features like little tunnels or other very strange features. That's very very cool icebergs to see sometimes. So as I said, we are working basically round the clock, 24 hours. And so we do map the ocean, but we also, of course, there to find out what the water temperature is there any warm water. And the device that we're using for this is it's called CTD for measuring conductivity, temperature, and depth. Conductivity is a way to measure salinity in the water. So actually measuring salinity and temperature with depth. And we have this device that's going to be lowered in the water. Inside of these, they're like sensors for temperature and conductivity and other like oxygen and other things. And then we have some bottles to take water samples on the outside, and that's going to be lowered into the water. And then we take profiles so we can actually see what the water, how the water temperature changes with depths. And these are different profiles and different stations, and we measure it to see like what the differences from different locations. And so what you can see that in the surface, a lot of the water here is relatively cold, and you probably cannot see the numbers in the degrees Celsius. So relatively cold means just around the freezing of the water, of salt water in Antarctica, which is about maybe like, 28, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, so a bit below the freezing point, where the relatively warm water that we see here below 400 meters, 500 meters water depth. So it's not really warm. It's just like, 34, maybe 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's above freezing, but it's enough warm because there's so much water of it. It's like just this little bit above freezing is enough to actually melt the glacier substantially. So that's considered like warm water. So it's not really like, bathtub, not really warm, but it's relatively warm enough to actually freeze, to melt the ice, where the rest is, really close to the freezing point. Just to show you other things, so they take water samples, and some of the water samples get analyzed on the ships. They have actually a little chemistry lab on the boat to do some basic analysis of the water. Other water samples get bottled up and taken to labs at home to do other analysis of the water. Sometimes we cannot go, with a ship and when the ice is too thick or under the shelf ice. So what over the last couple of years increasingly is happening. So we send these robot devices under the ice. They go and collect water temperature and other data for us. So we have a bigger GPU-shaped robot here, AutoSub devices that can go for a couple of hours a day, 1 or 2 days. And then we have these things that's called gliders. They're not as fast and less controls, but they can go for several weeks and collect this data. And on the last expedition, we actually had some biologists with that, and they have a new method. They actually encounter the help from the local natives to collect some of the data. So they go and they glue this sensor with the antenna on some of the seals. This gets glued on the fur, and once they get molten after like a couple months or a year, the sensors fell off. But as long as they're stuck to the fur, they basically collect data also from temperature and salinity on each of their dives, and then when they come up to breathe air, then actually sending the data with the antenna. So that's a sample of data collected by seals. And they might not be as precise as what we collect with a ship, but they get to a lot of places that we cannot cover with a ship. So they bring a lot of extra information. So very helpful as well. The other thing we're doing sometimes on a trip, because I study the bottommost, we're collecting sediment samples. So it's usually a little muddy exercise. So we have big metal tubes that we stick into the bottom of the ocean and extract a sediment there, or we have like smaller tubes. And the idea is to, the sediment collects there over a long time, like from tens to hundreds to thousands of years. And they're basically with everything that's collected in between the sediments. It's kind of a record of what the conditions were at the time. So we can maybe find out like when was the first time warm water was coming to the area, or when was the last time an area was covered with ice that's now open water. So basically we use this information to get a record over the past, how things have changed in the past. It also helps us to, or the modelers, to forecast what's happening to the ice sheet in the future. Again, with the samples, similar to the water samples, some of them get sampled on the ship, others get packed and then sent back to for analysis lab in the home. But I'll just show you that the ship, it's pretty big, but they have their own labs and things on board, and there's a lot of people really working. Okay, so we study the seafloor, and I just will show you that it's not dead at all. It looks a lot of sediment, but we had some devices that we actually captured with a camera at the bottom, and because it had lights on, you can actually see that here there's a lot of little critters coming in. That's krill, that's on the bottom of the food chain. So whales, penguins, seals, they go for those, and there's a lot of them there. And then one of the guys who got really lucky, we actually saw this squid here. So it's very exciting. I mean, it's not we study this, but we're collecting this extra data for other people who then, look at the ecology. Something we do also, we actually park the ship in the ice, and then other colleagues collect the water ice samples from the sea ice to see how it formed over the years. So they have a drill where they can drill. And when you do this, sometimes you get also visits from the locals. That's always very exciting. They're very curious and see what's going on happening there. And so that's basically all the work we do. And then, at the beginning of the trip in January, there's basically sunlight almost all around. So this would be, how dark it's get at midnight in the middle of the night, not really dark. But then as we go on to late February, March, it gets darker. We actually get sunsets, and the sun goes down a little bit for a couple hours. And it's also getting colder at the time. So ice is forming, and because if the sun is up all day, it's not that cold on the ship. But if it gets darker, then we get colder winds sometime, and then the ice is starting freezing, less open water, and then it's usually time for us to go back home. While the new sea ice is forming, because we don't want to get stuck in the ice. And so that's ice getting denser and denser, and then basically that's the end, and we're going back home again.
We have lots of questions, which is great.
I saw that. That's great too.
It's great. Thank you so much for our audience. So Frank, I'm going to try to pull some of them together. I think there are some that follow certain themes. First, I think animals was a very popular topic. So you pointed out that you've seen the penguins, and there's sea life on the ocean floors. I think one of the questions was whether you've ever seen a narwhal in Antarctica.
No, narwhals. I mean, I've seen whales, but I haven't really shown pictures, but because when I have with my camera, they are really small in the beginning, but I've seen whales, but there are no narwhals. Narwhals are in the Arctic, they're around Greenland. In the Antarctic, we've seen there are orcas a lot and minke whales a lot, and then near the Antarctic Peninsula, you see humpback whales too. But usually they come up when I'm not watching on the
Yeah. Are they nice? One of the questions was, are the penguins nice when they come visit, even as you're doing field work?
Yeah, they're not. I mean, they're just curious. I think they just come and check out, and they're nice. I mean, they're not like threatening. And, some of the, we see adelies and emperors. So emperors are really big. They're like, 2-3 feet tall. But they're not coming too close. They're keeping a safe distance, but they're just curious. They come and look at the ship. So
that's great. There's a couple of questions about the ice, and I think some of the photos that you showed. I think one of the photos was when you had the 4 iceberg images kind of side by side, or maybe it was the one before that. But there was a question about how is the edge of the ice so straight? And then there's also a question about the depth of ice walls. So I'm going to give you those two to tackle.
Yeah, so if maybe the ice walls is a big thing, like what you see in the background for me, for example. So this is part of the ice shelf. That's like when the glacier starts moving and starting floating. So what you see, that might be like, I don't know, 100, 150 feet high. It's pretty tall, but it's underneath water. It's maybe another like 800, 900 feet. So it's really, really thick. And because it's so thick, so when it starts cracking, it just cracks in the middle and breaks up and drifts off. And so that's why it's really usually pretty small. Then over time, what's happening, the edges get eaten up from waves and, mostly like waves and melting of the ice and wind. And if this breaks in smaller pieces, sometimes actually the icebergs, which starts very white like this, but they become very small. And then they become actually like taller than they are wide. And then they flip to the side and, then you see the underside and you get all kinds of funny shapes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, a couple of questions about your experience sort of on the ship. So how do you, I think maybe you mentioned this, but how do you get to the ship? Do you like being on the ship? How do you get on top of the glacier from the boat? How long does it take to get by boat to Antarctica in those very rough, choppy waters?
Oh, yeah. So I thought I mentioned, but maybe not. So it varies. So it takes about a week. I mean, it depends if you go directly. Sometimes, so the shortest way from Chile to the Antarctic Peninsula would be 3 to 4 days to get there. If you go to the Amundsen Sea, the Thwaites Glacier, to the outer edge of the ice axe, it's about 8 days, 8, 9 days. So it can be a long time. It's not always storming there. I mean, you have some nice days too on the things, but there's basically a storm system every 3, 4 days. So usually get hit by one storm if you go back one way if you're crossing.
Okay.
Yeah, and the trips are usually like 6 to 8 weeks because it takes almost like at least a week to get there. So you have a lot of time working. So my longest trip was 3 months on a ship. The shortest maybe to Antarctica was 6 weeks. So there's in between.
Okay.
And I don't know. Some people have problems being on a ship, but I like it. And you also get used to the motions. And once you're on the ice, it's not moving that much. So it's easy.
That's great. All right, thank you. Okay, next series of questions. I think I want to go back to the beginning. There were a couple questions about the warm water. And so how does the warm water get to the ice, and where do the circumpolar waters form, or how do they form?
Yeah, so I'm not an oceanographer, but I think so that has to do with the whole global ocean circulation. So it's actually in some areas of Antarctica, it's very cold water forming, and there's also cold water forming in Greenland on the 2 poles, and it's flowing towards the equator, and there's some warm water coming towards from the equator towards Antarctica. It's like somewhere in the middle ocean water depths. And then it gets basically trapped in a current that goes around Antarctica in the middle ocean. And in some areas, this warm water that comes, it's heated up somewhere in the mid-latitude, so near the equator, closer to Antarctica, that's trapped there, then gets pushed onto the continental shelf. But, as the oceans are heating up, you get more warm water. into the system, and also the wind systems are changing a little, maybe bringing it closer to Antarctica in some places.
Okay. Great, thank you. And then we have lots of questions around the theme of what's it like just to sort of be there. So one question is, how cold is it when you go, which is typically, I think you mentioned December, January, February, which is summer in Antarctica. How cold is it? And then is it, this is about the ice in Antarctica and is actually safe if you decide to put it in a drink of yours and you bring it back on board onto the ship.
So the first thing is actually, it can vary a lot. So actually it's often on the ship because we at the edge, we like near the open water and it's around freezing, with a lot of sunlight. It's not that cold. So it can be actually, sometimes I send emails to my wife. It's actually sometimes in February or January, it's cold in New York. When you have a cold spike here, then it's in the ship on Antarctica, but it can also change around. You get if there's a cold wind blowing from the continent, then it can also be easily being pretty cold that you can't really do much work on the outside as well, because some of the instruments, I guess, start freezing, especially like when it starts getting darker later on. So it varies. So that can be really, like, I don't know, that would be like, minus 10, 15 Celsius. So that would, I don't know, that's probably similar in, minus degrees of Fahrenheit too. But other days it's just around freezing, just below, usually around 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And the ice question, yeah. So I wouldn't really take, a lot of the ice is sea ice, right? And the sea ice is frozen ocean water. So it's actually quite salty and like briny. So you don't want to put in your drink because it wouldn't taste. So if you have if you have a glacier and you get a piece of glacier ice, that's like pure ice and has big crystals. So you could take that one in theory and put it in your glasses. It's like as pure as ice that you can get.
That's great. Thank you. And then a couple of questions about, I think, the seafloor mapping or what happens underwater. And so one of the questions was, how long does it take for the sound waves to reach the ocean floor?
Oh, it depends on the depth a little, but that's just like sound travels like this 1,500 meters per second. So the deepest spot on the shelf is like around 1,500. So it takes 1 second down and 1 second up. So 2 seconds. And deeper, if it's shallower, then it's just a fraction of a second. In the deep ocean, when we have like, several kilometers, it can take a couple seconds.
Okay. Great. And a couple of questions here about sediments and the water. So let's start with the sediments. Do you find that what do you study from the sediment cores? Can you measure pollution from them? And do you find fossils or fossil fuels sometimes come with the sediments? So 2 questions related to that.
Yeah, actually there's different things we can see. So we can't really, luckily there's not too much pollution. Although there were some studies done in the peninsula where they actually now found in the surface layers, there is some microplastics too that now showing that's basically getting everywhere. Yeah. Well, we do, what a lot of people look at is actually microfossils. So we don't really see big fossils because of like marine sediments. It's very rare to find those, but we find microfossils like little plankton, like called diatoms or foraminifers. So there's a little microorganisms that live in the ocean and the die and then they get buried in the sediments. And this is basically what the people who study the sediments are looking for. They're looking because there are certain types that like warmer water, others like colder water, and some live under ice and some only when there's open ice. So if you find out which kind of microorganisms you see in the sediments and how they changed over time, you can see or reconstruct like, oh, there was open water here, there was ice above here, it was like warmer water, colder water, and things. And you can also, some of them, you can date the layers if you find enough of them and see like, okay, this layer is like 5,000 years old, 6,000 years old. fossil fuels, we haven't really found. Also, then that would be usually much deeper. We don't see those.
Okay, right. Do you study if the water is muddy, salty, or brackish? Those of you who might study what the water is like. And another water related question: have you seen? Are there underwater volcanoes there?
Okay, start with the volcano. So I haven't on the continent from Antarctica. We haven't seen underwater volcanoes where I have been. There are volcanoes on land, like near Thwaites Glacier. They're actually some of them stick out of the ice, some under the ice. You do see sometimes in the deep ocean, you see seamounts, which are like remnants of old volcanoes that are not necessarily active anymore. We can map those as well. And
do you study or do you measure water is muddy, salty?
Yeah. So that's one of the measure. We measure salinity together with temperature. So that it's usually salty, but what we do find something is like when the ice is melting, that we get near the glacier. So the melted water is fresh water, so it will mix with the salty water, makes it a little more brackish. It's not quite as brackish as you would see in like in an estuary or on the coastal here, where we have a lot of rain, but it's still like significantly like fresher than normal ocean water. So that's definitely something that the oceanographers look at to see how brackish, how less salty the water is, because then they can recalculate like how much water actually melted from the ice from that. And we do also look for muddy waters if you see. So usually the water is pretty clear, except when we go with some, land our devices on the bottom and stir up all the sediment, then it gets really muddy. But so I do also take water samples and I sometimes filter it and trying to find out if there is, mud particles or things that maybe when there's some meltwater like under the glacier when it's still grounded and coming out of the glacier, that can have fine particles and mud with them. So they try to filter and try to find out. That's another indication if there's meltwater coming from under the grounded ice sheet, the ice that's sitting on the bedrock. So people sometimes filter, there's not that much in there, so you have to filter a lot of water, but they have big bottles for that purpose.
Okay, great. We're at time, but I'm going to take a few extra minutes and go over a couple more questions. I think there were a couple questions about the ice core that people drill out, or those who study the ice. Do you know how old some of those ice records have sort of can go back? And what else have you seen when you pull out those cores?
Yeah, so the example that I showed, just because we did it from the ship, there was basically from the sea ice. So this is only usually a couple years maximum. So often most of the sea ice is forming every year, melting every year. There are some sections when it doesn't melt in certain areas for a couple of years, so it can get thicker and a couple years old. So so they've just measured like how many years they can see, and there's usually like different cycles when it gets a little more salty and a little fresher in it. And another thing they also look at is a lot of plankton. It's living in the ice. It's actually one of the reasons you have all those penguins and seals near the edge of the ice, and when we go there, because when the ice melts, the sea ice is melting, it releases a lot of the plankton and nutrients, and then the krill comes and feed on it. So then it's the whole cycle there. Oh, there was the other question about how we get to the ice sheet. So usually, because it's so tall with the ship, we cannot go onto the glacier. We can only go on the sea ice. If you want to go on the glacier, you actually have to have a helicopter on the ship. There's a Palma, we usually don't have that. I mean, I've been on another ship, the German ship before, where they had a helicopter to go on the ice. A lot of the ice research that's done near these glaciers, that's actually where the people, they fly, from McMurdo. They have also like these airplanes that go from McMurdo the base, from the station further inland, and then they fly from there. And this is also what they're using. So if you go and drill through the ice cores, like deep ice cores through the glaciers, you can get actually ice that's like many thousands, like hundreds of thousands, even I think the oldest is like 150,000, 200,000 years old ice from the ice core. But that's more on the inside of Antarctica, not near the edge.
Okay, right. And we had a question, where is this? So why is part of the ice in the ocean? When did I get to that?
Well, part of the, I think it's just, let's say, because it's like, there's only a limited amount of continent there, and the ice is like taking over, it's growing and growing, and then at some point the end of it just ends up and it comes to the ocean. It's just, and you know, growing over time and taking over, and if it's thick enough, it's just sitting on the bottom of the, you know, whatever it's, I call like bedrock, but it's sometimes like not rock, but sediments, whatever. It's the hard substrate under the ice.
Okay, great. And then I think we'll wrap up with a couple of sort of general questions about sort of field work in Antarctica. So I don't think there's an airport there, and I think you mentioned McMurdo is. Well, is there an airport? It's a good question.
So McMurdo, as I showed, the station itself is relatively ice-free, but they so they have the airfield is on the ice. So they put a little like air control tower there, and they have, but it's basically they do make a runway on the ice. And some of the other stations in the Antarctic Peninsula, so they do have a real airfield like on the rocks. So there's, I mean, it's not like a big airport where you can go through, but they have like runways, hangar, and air control. So.
Okay. All right, great. Have you ever, is there a dangerous aspect of working in Antarctica or doing field work out there?
I don't know, in safety, yeah, it can be. I mean, on the ship, you have a lot of heavy machinery. I mean, it's like, you know, if you're working in a heavy machinery construction site or something, it can be dangerous. You have to have like helmet, safety gear. I mean, the water is very cold, obviously, you know, and you don't want to be falling in the water without like safety gear. So yeah, I mean, they all take it very safety and, you know, take it slow and be careful with doing this. So I mean, this can happen, and there's always a danger that if you don't leave early enough, you might get stuck in the ice with a ship. But the captains are usually really good in reading. We're getting like ice data all the time and reading the information, so making sure that, you know, when it's freezing it too much, then, you know, they get out there in time. So I mean, you know, they're really good about safety. I mean, if you work on the ice at land, you have crevasses, and if you go on a ice sheet, a sea ice, it can be, you know, too thin, you could fall in. But they usually have like people trained and going and testing the ice and measuring out before you do anything with it. So a lot of safety issues. I mean, the biggest issue is that you're far away. You know, it takes a week, maybe like 4 or 5 days to get to the next research station. So if somebody gets really sick, so, you know, getting out there it's tricky. But they have a hospital on, like, they don't have a doctor on the American ship, but they have a hospital and pharmacy. They have a lot of things that they can do, and they can do telemedicine and things like that if they need it. But usually, you know, everybody tries to avoid this, and usually nothing really bad happens.
That's good to know. Thanks. One last question about animals. Well, actually, second last question about animals. People were very interested about penguins, obviously. You know, how many do you usually see, and do they typically kind of stay together with each other? So that was one question about penguins, and then the other question was about how you tag the seals for them to actually, you know, dive and give you that research information, that data.
Yeah, so the first one is the penguins. it depends, like it varies a lot. I mean, where we are, I think is where the food for them is, and if you're close to there, but sometimes you can see a couple like, every day, and they are usually 2, 3 together. Sometimes you see a single one, sometimes you see a group of 5 or 6 or 8. I mean, we also, if they're like it can be if there's an area where they like have a colony or something where the kids, and there can be like thousands of them as well. But and about the seal tagging, so they have a veterinarian, like a animal doctor, and the specialist. I didn't do that, but they basically have a little narcotics. They tag them with a little blow dart, and then so they go to sleep. Then they glue the thing on, and then they wake up, and and then they basically go and do is collect the data. And it's just like, somebody would attach something to the hair, and then the hair would fall off eventually.
Great. And I think we're going to wrap up. I apologize. We're not going to get to all of the questions, but I think we can, for those of you who are interested, I'm going to leave my email address in the chat box. And then if you do have questions, feel free to email me after, and I'll pass them along to Frank. But I think a great place to end is sort of what got you sort of really interested in exploring Antarctica and becoming a scientist. What are your favorite parts, and were you even interested in science in middle school? Did you know very early on that you wanted to be a scientist?
Not sure. I mean, I didn't plan when I was middle school to go to Antarctica, but I had a thing when I was like, oh, I want to I watched this Jacques Cousteau movies and was like great and things like that. And then I was like deciding what I wanted to do. I always liked maps, actually. That was my main through. So I wanted to do something with maps. And I somehow ended up studying geophysics back in Germany, as you maybe notice from my accent. So I'm actually originally from Germany. And so I studied there geophysics. And then there was an opportunity basically that the German Polar Research Institute was a call for students who are close to finishing up to go on an expedition. They needed some extra helpers, so I applied and got lucky and got in my first Antarctic expedition, and then I got hooked doing that. I mean, I'm on and off, and yeah, and it's very exciting. I went to sea and I liked it, and it's great. And I usually, by the way, seeing seasickness is another question. So on the big ships, I don't really get really seasick. I have a couple early cruises. I got a little seasick sometimes, but now I take some pills, and it's a couple of days of being uncomfortable, but I get used to it. Most people get used to it after a couple of days. There's only very few who suffer, unfortunately, for most of it, but you can control it pretty well. With pills nowadays.
Right. Okay. So yeah, maybe for a last sort of piece, what is your favorite part about going to Antarctica? Good end.
This is really a question. There's so many different things. I mean, it's just the seeing the ice. It's so great, but I like being on the ship. And well, maybe part of it is there's still so much that's unexplored. You feel a little bit, you go there and it's something, discover something new. You don't have to go to Antarctica to really do this. Other part of the oceans, other people study this as well, but it's just, finding something. I mean, we don't see them on the area here, like underwater volcanoes, but some other people find that, or something unexpected, you see, and it's just really exciting to see those. Things.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. We've had such a great list of questions. I'm so sorry that we are unable to get to all of them. But as I said, I left my email address in the chat box. So if you do have, it's just Cassie, CASSIE @ldeo.columbia.edu. If you have questions, please email me. I will definitely pass them on to Frank. Frank, thank you so much for doing this session. I think clearly a lot of people are very interested about going to Antarctica. and really great to know that if you go, you do not have to pack your own parka. So
No.
thank you.
And also just there was a question like how you have to be a researcher? Not necessarily, by the way. I mean, it's good. So there's some tourists can go if they have a lot of money. There's some tourist ships going to the peninsula, but it's also, the ship is not only researchers, a lot of technicians, they have computer people, they have cooks. You know, the research station McMurdo, they have even firefighters, carpenters, plumbers. You know, there's a lot of people. You have to be a little like, you know, adventurous and like to do this. And I think for most people, the big hurdle is that you are like in a small group of people for a long time. You have to be comfortable with that. But now we're practicing that.
Exactly. We practiced that during quarantine, so we're all ready to go to it.
And yeah, and thanks everybody. It's really great. It's good questions. I'm happy to answer whatever, you know, Casey's forwarding me.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Frank. Thanks everybody for attending. And make sure you tune in the rest of the week for Open House. So openhouse.ldeo.columbia.edu to check out our lineup for the rest of the week. So have a good afternoon or rest of your day, wherever you are. Thanks, everyone.
No, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.